If there's one thing that I've become a big proponent of in storytelling in recent years, it's the ethical treatment of fictional characters. In fact, I'd be out there on goddamn strike for the sake of this cause if I had to, because there is an uncomfortably large number of you out there who absolutely love seeing characters get put through the most traumatic, horrible experiences for the sake of your mindless entertainment, and maybe at the end of it, you get a good story along with it. And hey, I'm not saying that I can't like some good old suffering either. My profile picture should kind of give away that I can be a fan of those kinds of series as well. But there's always a spectrum when it comes to anything, and I think there are some stories that can take these kinds of concepts in really over-the-top, too far directions that quickly lose their original purpose and sincerity. A little while back, I watched No Game, No Life for the very first time, and for the most part, I can say that I really did thoroughly enjoy it. This came out in 2014, and it honestly feels like the genesis of isekai anime that are fueled by a very dry wit and cynicism that ends up becoming its soul. It has an excellent premise, a pretty rich world that begs to be further explored, the visuals are extremely trippy and awesome, the matches and mind games that ensue are fun. There's just one little problem that was nagging at me the entire time I watched this series. The two main characters are f***ing assholes, man. And I don't mean in the likable, oh haha, you're such a rascal kind of way. I mean these two egocentric maniacs are legitimately toxic as hell to the point where I legitimately had a hard time connecting to them emotionally. I mean, there's an entire plotline later in this series where the brother character goes missing, and while it did have a pretty good payoff, I can tell you that I was absolutely not invested at all emotionally in whether or not he was okay. This is very much a series that I enjoyed for the more surface level aspects like the genuinely creative set pieces or the interesting world building than I did for any kind of sentimentality or heart, which would ordinarily not really be an issue for me. I'm always down to enjoy a series superficially. I don't need every series to be this super deep, complex masterpiece, but No Game No Life wants to have it both ways. It so desperately wants you to care about its characters, its themes, its messages, and yet in spite of all that, it constantly undercuts them in a way that is very off-putting. This is where we start running into problems, and this, in my opinion, is how not to bully your characters. The general conceit of No Game No Life is that two freak prodigies of basically every single kind of game in the world get sent to another world where society itself is dictated by people who play games. You can go so far as to conquer and govern entire countries just through a battle of chess, and this is what leads the two main characters, Sora and Shiro, on a quest to unite the world's nations through games, and eventually let me check my notes here real quick. Oh yeah, challenge God. A very messy explanation there, but essentially the point is that this is a really goddamn cool premise, and in theory, these two main characters are characters that you want to root for. They're the talented underdogs starting from nowhere, nobody knows who they are, and they have to climb their way up to challenging a deity. So why then do these characters actually kinda suck? Why are they assholes? Why am I not crying my eyes out when Shiro is left all alone without her degenerate older brother? And that's a tricky question, because obviously all of this is in the eye of the beholder. In fact, despite all of my slander here, a lot of people absolutely love both of these characters, and honestly, I can totally see why. I've mentioned this a lot in previous videos, but to me, the main appeal of isekai that I think draws so many people in is that idea of self-inserting into a character that you think is cool. And Sora and Shiro are both very, very cool. They're absurd geniuses who rise against the odds, figure out clever solutions to problems, and have so much natural charisma despite being shut-ins that nobody can resist flocking around them. But to me, the people that flock around them are precisely why I find these two characters extremely unlikable at times, and even more specifically, it all revolves around the treatment of one specific character. Stephanie Dola is a prominent character in No Game, No Life. The entire first arc practically revolves around her quest of recovering this kingdom that used to be ruled by her grandfather. And the one thing that the series makes explicitly clear, even from the very first episode, is that this is a genuinely kind-hearted, sweet, innocent, pure character that is just trying to do her best. She's trying to reclaim this kingdom that honestly should have been hers to begin with and make the lives of her citizens better. This is a character that you want to root for, and yet the other thing the series makes explicitly clear from the very first episode is that it is going to make her life as horrible and awful as it possibly can before things get better. I mean, the very first appearance we have of her is another character cheating her out of all of her possessions and status. But wait, I hear you tell me, that's actually pretty typical storytelling there. You want to put your good-hearted character through some tribulations and trials so it's satisfying when the protagonist eventually comes to help and support them. And I agree with you, that's a very standard, very effective storytelling technique, and it's the reason why I didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary in episode 1. However, it's only in episode 2 and beyond when you truly realize that is not the purpose for why Steph is here. It's a byproduct, sure. Sora and Shiro do end up helping her reclaim the kingdom and the territory that was lost, but the real reason Stephanie Dola is in this story is to be the literal embodiment of a punching bag for every single character surrounding her. And this is where it gets even more tricky, because I could tell you, hell, I could tell a fan, any number of the horrible, gross, genuinely mean things that people do to Steph in this series, and they could just as easily hand wave it off as, oh, she's just a joke character. That's just a gag. That's the point of her persona. She's a cartoon. She's meant to be the butt of all the jokes in this series. And I would have a pretty hard time refuting that, because they're right. That is the essential purpose of this character. She's a walking joke. So if I know all of this, then why does it still bother me? Why does it cross that line from funny gag to hurtful, mean, and unenjoyable to watch? And obviously this is all subjective from my point of view. That line is different for everybody. I'm sure many of you will just tell me, it's just a joke, man. Why are you taking this cartoon so seriously? You're not gonna offend a drawing. And look, I am fully aware how silly some of this must sound, but I have to make it clear that I'm not some easily offended snowflake, okay? I know this is fiction. I know what jokes are, I think, but that line is still there. And the biggest reasons why I think No Game, No Life crosses it are the extremes that these quote-unquote jokes go to, and the fact that there really isn't any kind of balance to all of the awful ways that people treat her. I mean, we're talking public humiliation, physical abuse, the mockery of her family and her ideals. I mean, in the second goddamn episode, she's forced to fall in love with Sora through what is essentially hypnosis. I mean, I feel like Sora would be joining the Rudius camp of controversial protagonists if this came out today, but even then, at least Mushoku Tensei acknowledges that all of the shit that Rudius does is actually pretty messed up. In No Game, No Life, all of these terrible things are constantly being done by the main characters, and there's almost zero self-awareness that what they're doing and what they're saying is actually really fucked up. You're supposed to laugh. It's funny that Steph is mind-controlled into loving Sora. It's funny that she's treated like a literal dog in the streets that is forced to obey orders and remove all her clothes. It's funny that she goes through practically life-ending torture for the sake of decoying in some game. And hey, maybe it could be. Maybe all of this really could be funny in a certain context or execution, but No Game No Life's biggest flaw with Steph is that there is not any kind of balance to the way that characters treat her. Usually when you have these kinds of mean-spirited jokes and tauntings and comedic abuse of a character, the story goes out of its way to eventually build those things into development, sincerity, just genuinely heartfelt scenes that make those moments actually worth it in the long run. If there was more than one goddamn scene in this series where the characters genuinely acknowledge Steph and respect her as a human being, something that I'd like to point out is a fucking theme of this story, then maybe that line wouldn't have been crossed. Maybe I would actually feel something for these characters. But as it stands, the most acknowledgement you ever get out of Sora and Shiro towards Stephanie are a handful of token thank yous that essentially just boil down to, gee, we couldn't have done it without making you go through those horrible experiences. Now let's get back to making you go through more horrible experiences. Now, I fully realize that I may be the weird one here. I know a lot of people probably aren't thinking about it that deeply. I know that Sora and Shiro are just so goddamn cool and smart that it doesn't really matter what mean things they do to other people. Everyone's gonna love them anyways. But for me, I can personally say that something I've grown to love a lot in storytelling is just vibes, man. I love camaraderie. I love characters getting along, showing respect to each other, supporting one another in their lives to their ultimate goals. I love that shit, man. I love that kind of positivity in storytelling. If you have a group of characters that are essentially family, teasing and messing with each other, but still you can tell they really do love and respect one another, that's basically the key to my heart. I will probably really enjoy your series, even if it sucks in pretty much every other way. So in No Game No Life, when you have what is essentially anti-camaraderie, anti-vibes in this series, it does end up becoming a problem for me in a way that detracts from the overall experience. However, if you want an example of this kind of character in a context that not only works, but proves that I'm not totally against having a dedicated bullied personality, then look no further than one of my favorite anime comedies ever, Konosuba. Now, Konosuba is a dry, sardonic, witty comedy that is arguably even more mean-spirited with some of its jokes and gags than No Game No Life, and yet despite that, it never ever loses its heart. It smartly remembers that these characters have to ultimately like each other in order to want to travel as a group and go on all of these adventures together. And in Konosuba, there's a character that is shockingly similar to Stephanie's role in No Game No Life, called Yunyun. To skip all of the preamble, Yunyun is essentially another punching bag-esque character within the world of Konosuba. She is constantly depicted as this character that just absolutely nobody wants to associate with. She challenges and loses to Megumin every chance she gets, and ultimately, she's just the kind of character that despite trying her best, ends up getting the short end of the stick very frequently. So why does this character work then? Why does all of this work here when it doesn't in No Game No Life? And again, this all comes down to your personal perspective and preference on things, but the reason I think Yunyun works a lot better for me is because of that lack of balance that I mentioned earlier. Where No Game No Life struggles to include even half-hearted acknowledgement towards Stephanie, Konosuba uses all of this bullying to its advantage to give you genuinely heartwarming, genuinely emotional, genuinely great development with the way that people treat and acknowledge her, especially from Megumin, and especially in the movie where practically the entire focus is around Yunyun really coming into her own and becoming somebody that people can respect. Like I said before, it's really something as simple as that. It's really as simple as just showing that people can respect and appreciate this character that goes a long way in balancing out more mean-spirited jokes and comedy. And honestly, Konosuba isn't even really that bad with it. Certainly not as bad as No Game No Life is. At its worst, you usually just have characters ignore Yunyun instead of, going out of their way to make her life as miserable as possible. So that ultimately is how and how not to bully your characters. At least in this context, there's always going to be a difference in approach based on what you're making. If you're making something super cynical, super dark and edgy, maybe you do want all of your characters to be completely awful, but in this case, if you really want to have a straightforward and sincere story about these underdogs making it to the top, making the underdogs less asshole-ish would definitely help, and I think a better balance in the bullying would have gone a long way. Let me know your favorite characters to bully in the comments below, join the Discord server in the description. I love you all, and I will see you in the next video.